In 1917, World War I soldiers pose, but something in the background reveals a mystery. In 1917, during one of humanity's darkest hours, a simple photograph was taken on the Western Front. What should have been just another wartime portrait became something far more unsettling. Today, we're diving into a mystery that has puzzled historians, photographers, and paranormal researchers for over a century. What lurks in the background of this innocent soldier's photo? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover might change how you look at old photographs forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in the Somme region of northern France. The trenches were flooded knee-deep with muddy water that mixed with everything soldiers tried desperately not to think about. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood of the British Expeditionary Force's 2nd Battalion stood in what passed for dry ground, a small elevated patch behind the forward trenches where officers occasionally gathered to review maps and strategy. It was October 15, 1917, and the Battle of Passchendaele was grinding men into the mud with mechanical efficiency. Thomas was 26 years old, though his face told the story of someone much older. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly even when he tried to hold them still. He'd been at the front for 14 months, surviving when so many others hadn't. "Sergeant Blackwood, gather your men," Lieutenant Henry Crawford called out, his voice cutting through the constant rumble of distant artillery. Crawford was newer to the front, only 3 months in, and still held on to certain formalities that veteran soldiers had long abandoned. "We're having a photograph taken." Thomas looked at the lieutenant with weary confusion. "A photograph, sir? Now?" "Orders from command," Crawford replied, adjusting his mud-stained uniform jacket. "They want to document the battalion before the next push. For the records, they say. For history." Thomas knew what that really meant. It meant command expected heavy casualties in the coming offensive. They wanted faces recorded before those faces disappeared forever into the French soil. He gathered his squad, what remained of it. Private James Whitmore, barely 19, with red hair that stuck out beneath his helmet. Corporal David Morrison, 32, a former schoolteacher from Manchester who rarely spoke anymore. Private Peter Walsh, 24, who still somehow maintained a sense of dark humor despite everything. And Private Robert Chen, 21, one of the few Chinese-Canadian soldiers in their battalion, who'd volunteered despite facing discrimination back home. The photographer was a civilian contractor named Arthur Pemberton, a thin man in his 50s who moved with nervous energy. His camera was an impressive piece of equipment mounted on a sturdy wooden tripod, a plate camera that captured images on glass negatives. Pemberton had been photographing the war for various newspapers and military archives, documenting everything from destroyed villages to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. "Right then, gentlemen," Pemberton announced, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that felt obscene against the backdrop of distant explosions. "Let's have you lined up here, 3 rows, tallest in back, please." The men arranged themselves with mechanical efficiency. 12 soldiers in total, with Lieutenant Crawford in the center of the front row. Behind them, the landscape stretched into devastation, shattered trees reduced to blackened stumps, shell craters filled with filthy water, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a farmhouse about 50 yards distant. Thomas stood in the back row, slightly to the left. The rain had momentarily stopped, though thick grey clouds promised more to come. The air smelled of wet earth, cordite, and decay. In the distance, a machine gun chattered briefly, then fell silent. "Hold perfectly still," Pemberton instructed, ducking beneath the black cloth attached to his camera. "This will take several seconds of exposure. Any movement will blur the image. Think of something pleasant, somewhere far from here." Thomas tried to comply, but pleasant thoughts were hard to conjure. He thought of his sister Mary back in Liverpool, wondered if she'd received his last letter. He thought of the corner pub near his childhood home, the taste of proper beer, the sound of laughter that wasn't edged with hysteria. The shutter clicked. Pemberton emerged from beneath his cloth. Excellent. Just one more for safety. They held their positions again. Thomas noticed Private Whitmore's jaw was clenched tight, saw how Corporal Morrison's eyes had gone distant and glassy. These men were exhausted beyond anything civilian life could prepare someone for. They'd seen friends torn apart by shells, watched gas attacks turn men into choking, blind creatures who died in agony. They'd bayoneted other young men in close combat, felt the terrible resistance of steel entering human flesh. The second shutter clicked. "Done," Pemberton announced. "Thank you, gentlemen. May God keep you safe." The photograph session had taken less than 10 minutes. The men dispersed back to their duties, checking weapons, reinforcing trench walls, writing letters they hoped would reach home. None of them gave the photograph another thought. In a war where death arrived randomly and constantly, a simple picture seemed utterly inconsequential. Arthur Pemberton packed his equipment carefully, storing the exposed glass plates in padded boxes. He had dozens of such plates now, a growing archive of war's face. He would develop them at his makeshift darkroom in a relatively safe area 15 miles behind the lines. Most would be filed away in military archives, a few might appear in newspapers, but all would eventually be forgotten as the war ground on and the world moved toward an uncertain peace. Leave your comment about what you're thinking of this story so far, but this particular photograph wouldn't be forgotten. Not entirely. Because when Arthur Pemberton developed those plates 3 days later in his cramped darkroom, when the image slowly materialized in the chemical bath, he noticed something peculiar. At first, he dismissed it as a flaw in the plate, perhaps a spot of dirt on the lens or an accidental double exposure. Yet as he examined the negative more closely, holding it up to his lamp, his hands began to shake. In the background of the photograph, near the ruins of that destroyed farmhouse, there appeared to be a figure. Not one of the soldiers, they were all accounted for in their neat rows. This was someone else, or something else, standing among the rubble approximately 50 yards behind the posed men. The figure was unclear, indistinct, but undeniably present in both plates he'd exposed. Pemberton was a rational man, a professional photographer who understood his equipment and its limitations. He knew about light reflections, chemical imperfections, and the various ways photographic plates could be compromised. Yet this didn't fit any of those explanations. The figure appeared in the exact same position in both photographs, which ruled out random chemical artifacts. It had a human shape, or something approximating a human shape, but there was something wrong about its proportions, something that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus on the details. He decided not to mention it. The war produced enough horror without adding mysterious photographic anomalies to the burden. He filed the images away with hundreds of others, noting the date, location, and unit designation in his meticulous records. Within weeks, his attention moved to other assignments, other photographs, other faces that would soon be casualties. The photograph entered the archives of the British Imperial War Museum in 1919, after the armistice. It sat in storage for decades, one unremarkable image among thousands. The 12 soldiers in the picture had their own fates. Lieutenant Crawford was killed 6 days after the photograph was taken, hit by shrapnel during a bombardment. Corporal Morrison survived the war but committed suicide in 1923, unable to escape the memories. Private Whitmore lost his left leg to a landmine in March 1918, but lived until 1956. Private Walsh was gassed and spent his remaining years struggling to breathe, dying in 1931. Private Chen returned to Vancouver and faced renewed discrimination, eventually moving to China, where he died in 1945. Thomas Blackwood survived the war physically intact but emotionally shattered, working as a night watchman until his death in 1954. None of them ever saw the photograph. None knew what had been captured that rainy October day behind them, standing silent witness among the ruins. The photograph remained buried in archives for 60 years. Historians occasionally pulled it for exhibitions about World War I, appreciating its composition and the haunted expressions on the soldiers' faces. It appeared in a 1969 book about the Somme offensive, reproduced in grainy black and white alongside hundreds of other period images. No one noticed anything unusual. The figure in the background was too indistinct, too easily dismissed as a trick of shadow and damaged architecture. Then in 1979, a graduate student named Margaret Thorne was conducting research for her dissertation on photographic documentation of the Great War. She was working at the Imperial War Museum's archives in London, systematically examining thousands of images, taking notes on composition, subject matter, and historical context. It was tedious work, hour after hour of careful observation under bright archive lamps. Margaret was 28, intense and dedicated to her research. She'd grown up hearing stories about her grandfather who'd fought at Gallipoli, though he'd died before she was born. The war fascinated her, not the glory and heroism that propaganda had promoted, but the human cost, the psychological devastation, the way entire generations had been traumatized. On November 3, 1979, she pulled file box 247B, which contained photographs from October 1917 Somme region. The photograph of Sergeant Blackwood and his unit was 13th in the sequence. Margaret examined it with her magnifying glass, a habit she'd developed to catch small details. She noted the soldiers' expressions, the quality of their uniforms, the muddy conditions evident in their boots and trousers. Then her magnifying glass swept across the background. She stopped, moved the glass back, focused. "That's odd," she murmured to herself. Among the ruins of the farmhouse, partially obscured by a collapsed wall, there appeared to be a figure. Margaret's first thought was that it was another soldier, perhaps someone who'd wandered into the frame accidentally, but something about it didn't look right. The proportions seemed off, and there was a strange quality to how it appeared in the photograph, simultaneously sharp and blurry, as if existing at a different focal distance than everything around it. She made a note in her research journal: background anomaly, possible unintended subject or photographic artifact. Investigate further. Margaret requested permission to have the photograph professionally scanned and enhanced. The museum granted her request, curious about her findings. The scans were made using the best technology available in 1979, primitive by today's standards, but far superior to anything previously applied to this particular image. When the enhanced scans came back 2 weeks later, Margaret spent an entire evening examining them in her small London apartment. With enlargement and contrast adjustment, the figure became more visible, though not more comprehensible. It appeared to be human-shaped, roughly 6 feet tall, standing upright among the rubble. But there was something deeply wrong about it that Margaret couldn't articulate. The way shadows fell on it, or didn't fall. The way its outline seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the photograph couldn't quite capture whatever it was. Most disturbing were what might have been its features. Where a face should be, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the hands, if they were hands, appeared elongated, too many fingers, or perhaps fingers at wrong angles. Margaret showed the enhanced images to her dissertation advisor, Professor Edmund Hartley, a distinguished military historian in his 60s. They met in his cluttered office at the University of London, where books and papers competed for every available surface. "What do you make of this?" Margaret asked, spreading the enlargements across his desk. Professor Hartley studied them for several long minutes, his expression moving from curiosity to confusion to something approaching concern. He removed his reading glasses, cleaned them carefully, and put them back on to look again. "Where exactly was this photograph taken?" he asked finally. "Western Front, Somme region, October 1917, near a place called Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre. And you verified this isn't some kind of double exposure or darkroom trick? I've had it examined by a photographic expert at the museum. He says the negative shows no signs of manipulation. Whatever this is, it was there when the photograph was taken. Professor Hartley leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. You know the stories, I assume, about that sector? Margaret shook her head. What stories? Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre and the surrounding area saw some of the most intense fighting of 1916 and 1917. Tens of thousands died there. The local French population had stories even before the war, old legends about the area. During the war, soldiers from both sides reported unusual experiences, seeing things that shouldn't be there, hearing voices when no one was around. Some attributed it to shell shock, others to the stress of combat. But the reports were persistent enough that certain units refused to occupy specific sections of trench. Are you suggesting this is some kind of ghost? Margaret asked, unable to keep skepticism from her voice. I'm suggesting nothing, Hartley replied carefully. I'm merely providing historical context. What you do with that information is your decision. But Margaret, be careful with this. Academic reputations have been destroyed over far less controversial material. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. Margaret ignored her advisor's caution. She became obsessed with the photograph, spending every spare moment researching the location, the unit, and the soldiers pictured. She tracked down service records, discovering that most of the men had died during or shortly after the war. She found mentions of Sergeant Thomas Blackwood in several documents, a reliable soldier mentioned twice for bravery under fire, who'd survived the war but apparently lived a quiet, unremarkable life afterward. She also researched the photographer, Arthur Pemberton. He died in 1938, leaving behind thousands of war photographs and detailed journals about his work. Margaret traveled to the Imperial War Museum's document collection to examine these journals. Pemberton's entries were meticulous, recording technical details about each photograph, exposure times, lighting conditions, equipment used. The entry for October 15, 1917 was different. After his usual technical notes, Pemberton had added a personal observation, which he rarely did. Developed plates from Beaucourt session, something peculiar in background of group photograph. Cannot explain. Makes me uneasy to look at it directly. Have decided not to mention to military authorities. Enough troubles without adding to them. May God forgive me if this decision is wrong. Margaret felt a chill reading those words. Pemberton had seen it too, 70 years ago. He'd noticed the figure and been disturbed by it enough to record his unease. Yet he'd said nothing, filed it away, let it disappear into archives. She decided to visit the location. In December 1979, Margaret took a week's leave from her studies and traveled to France. The town of Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre had been rebuilt after the war, a quiet rural community that bore few visible scars from the conflict. But the surrounding landscape still showed signs. The ground was uneven in certain areas where trenches had been, and local farmers still occasionally turned up unexploded ordnance when ploughing fields. Margaret hired a local guide, an elderly man named Claude Moreau, whose grandfather had lived in the area during the war. They walked to the approximate location where the photograph had been taken. It took several hours to identify the spot, comparing landscape features visible in the old photograph with current topography. The farmhouse was long gone, replaced by a different structure built in the 1920s, but the general area could be determined by triangulating from natural features, a particular rise in the terrain, a cluster of trees that had survived the war. "This area," Claude said in accented English, "has always had stories, even before the war. My great-grandmother said the old ones warned about this place. They said the boundary was thin here." "Boundary?" Margaret asked. "Between what?" Claude shrugged. "Between here and somewhere else." She was old-fashioned, believed in things the church doesn't approve. After the war, people said things walked here at night, things that looked like men but weren't. Several locals claimed to have seen them. But who can say? The war did terrible things to people's minds. They stood at the location as afternoon light faded. Margaret felt nothing unusual, no supernatural presence or eerie sensation. Just cold December wind and the quiet of rural France. Yet looking at the ground beneath her feet, knowing what had happened here, the violence, the death, the suffering compressed into this small piece of earth, she understood why people's imaginations might conjure ghosts. She took photographs of the location, though she knew they would show nothing but contemporary farmland. As they walked back to Claude's car, Margaret asked him if he'd ever seen anything unusual here. Claude was quiet for a moment. "Once," he said finally. "When I was a boy, maybe 12 years old. I was walking home late, cutting through these fields. I saw a man standing in the distance, just standing perfectly still. I called out, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, I don't know how to describe it. He didn't walk away. He just wasn't there anymore, like he'd never been there at all. I ran home and never cut through these fields alone again." Margaret returned to London with more questions than answers. She wrote her dissertation without including the mysterious photograph, following Professor Hartley's advice to maintain academic credibility. But she couldn't let it go. She published a paper in an obscure journal about anomalous images in war photography, mentioning the Blackwood photograph as one example. The paper attracted little attention in academic circles, but found an audience among amateur researchers interested in the paranormal. Word of the photograph spread slowly through underground channels, paranormal research groups, military history enthusiasts, people fascinated by unexplained phenomena. In 1983, a British television documentary program called Mysteries of War contacted Margaret, requesting permission to feature the photograph in an episode about unexplained occurrences during World War I. Margaret was hesitant. She'd worked hard to maintain her academic reputation, and association with paranormal entertainment could damage her career. But curiosity won out. She agreed to participate, with the condition that the program treat the subject seriously, not as sensationalist entertainment. The episode aired in November 1983. It featured interviews with Margaret, enhanced images of the photograph, and dramatic reenactments of the 1917 photograph session. The program also included interviews with a photographic forensics expert named Dr. Simon Blackwell, who worked with Scotland Yard analysing crime scene photographs. Dr. Blackwell's analysis was both fascinating and frustrating. He confirmed that the image showed no signs of double exposure or darkroom manipulation. The figure appeared to be genuinely present at the location when the photograph was taken. However, he noted several anomalies that defied normal photographic principles. "The light falls wrong on this figure," he explained on camera, pointing to specific areas of the enlarged image. "See here? The shadows around it don't match the lighting conditions affecting the soldiers in the foreground. And here, this edge, it's simultaneously in focus and out of focus, which shouldn't be physically possible with this type of camera and lens configuration. It's as if the figure exists at multiple focal distances simultaneously." The program drew respectable viewership, but didn't cause any major sensation. Most viewers found it interesting but not particularly compelling. However, it did attract the attention of someone who would take the investigation in an unexpected direction. James Weatherby was a retired professor of physics from Cambridge University, 72 years old, with a lifelong interest in anomalous phenomena that he'd kept separate from his professional work. He'd spent decades quietly investigating cases that might represent genuine, unexplained occurrences, trying to apply scientific methodology to subjects usually dominated by pseudoscience and wishful thinking. Weatherby contacted Margaret in early 1984. They met at a cafe in London, where he spread his own research across the table, notes, diagrams, and photographs collected over 40 years. "I've been documenting what I call intrusion events," he explained, his voice carrying the careful precision of a trained scientist. "Moments when something appears in our reality that doesn't quite belong here. Most can be explained. Unusual atmospheric phenomena, photographic artifacts, misidentification of ordinary objects. But a small percentage resist conventional explanation." He pulled out several photographs from his collection. One showed a Victorian street scene from 1895 with a figure in the background wearing what appeared to be modern clothing. Another showed a battlefield photograph from World War II with a strange light phenomenon that multiple witnesses had reported seeing. A third showed a crowd scene from 1952 with a person whose image appeared distorted in a way similar to the figure in the Blackwood photograph. "I've identified 17 cases over the past century that share similar characteristics," Weatherby continued. "All involve photography capturing something that appears human but displays anomalous properties, wrong shadows, unusual focus characteristics, proportions that don't quite match human anatomy, and in several cases the locations have histories of intense trauma or violence." Margaret leaned forward, intrigued despite her skepticism. "What are you suggesting? That these are ghosts, dimensional rifts, time travelers?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Weatherby said firmly. "I'm documenting patterns. Science begins with observation, not conclusion. What I can tell you is that these phenomena, whatever they are, seem to occur more frequently in locations where extreme human suffering has occurred. Battlefields, sites of disasters, places of mass death. Whether that's causation or correlation, I can't say." He pulled out a map of France, marked with red dots. "These indicate locations where similar photographs have been taken or unusual sightings reported during and after World War I. Notice the pattern. The dots clustered in specific areas: the Somme region, Verdun, Passchendaele, Ypres. All locations of horrific battles where hundreds of thousands had died. Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre sat at the center of one of the densest clusters. Margaret and Weatherby formed an unlikely partnership. He provided scientific rigor and decades of research experience. She brought her historical knowledge and access to military archives. Together, they spent the next 3 years investigating the Blackwood photograph and similar cases. They discovered that Arthur Pemberton, the photographer, had captured at least 3 other images with similar anomalies, all from the Western Front between 1916 and 1918. 2 of these photographs had been lost or destroyed over the years, but one remained in archives, a photograph of a field hospital with a strange figure visible in a distant doorway. Like the Blackwood photograph, it displayed the same unusual characteristics: wrong shadows, impossible focus, proportions that seemed almost human, but not quite. They also tracked down the few surviving relatives of the soldiers in the Blackwood photograph. Most had died by the 1980s, but they found Peter Walsh's daughter Eleanor living in Manchester. She was 68 years old, willing to talk about her father, though it clearly caused her pain. "He never spoke about the war," Eleanor told them, serving tea in her small sitting room. "Not a word. My mother said he was different when he came back, quieter, sadder. He worked at the post office for 30 years, came home every evening, was kind to us children. But you could see it in his eyes sometimes. He was somewhere else, somewhere terrible. He died when I was young, lung problems from being gassed. I don't remember him ever smiling, not really." She pulled out a small wooden box from a cabinet. Inside were her father's few possessions from the war, his service medal, some letters, and one photograph. It showed Peter Walsh with 2 other soldiers, different from the Blackwood group photograph. Margaret's breath caught when she saw it. In the background of this photograph, too, barely visible, was something that might have been a figure standing among ruins. "Did your father ever mention seeing anything unusual during the war?" Margaret asked carefully. "Anything he couldn't explain?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Once, when I was maybe 10, I heard him talking to my mother late at night. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd gotten up for water. He was saying something about how the dead didn't always stay buried, how sometimes they stood in the ruins watching. My mother told him not to talk like that it was just memories troubling him. But his voice, he sounded terrified, even 20 years after the war ended. Margaret and Weatherby left Eleanor's home with a copy of Peter Walsh's photograph, feeling the weight of something larger than they'd anticipated. This wasn't just one anomalous image. It was a pattern stretching across multiple photographs, multiple witnesses, all connected to one of the most traumatic events in human history. Leave your comment about what you're thinking of this story so far. Their research took them deeper into historical records. They found dozens of first-hand accounts from soldiers describing encounters with figures that didn't belong. Most had been dismissed as hallucinations caused by stress, exhaustion, or gas exposure. But the consistency of the descriptions was striking. Figures standing motionless in no man's land, shapes moving through trenches that disappeared when approached, presences felt but not quite seen. One account particularly stood out, from a soldier named William Thornton, written in a letter to his sister in December 1917. "Last night, standing watch, I saw a man in the ruins ahead. At first, I thought it was a German scout, but something was wrong. He was too still, and the moonlight seemed to pass through him rather than reflect off him. I called for the sergeant, but when he came, the figure was gone. The sergeant said it was my imagination, but I swear I saw it. I swear it was real, or as real as anything is in this hell." William Thornton had been in Sergeant Blackwood's battalion. He was killed in action 3 weeks after writing that letter, in early January 1918. By 1987, Margaret and Weatherby had compiled extensive research on what they termed the Blackwood phenomenon, the appearance of anomalous figures in photographs and witness accounts from the Western Front. They prepared a comprehensive report, intending to submit it to academic journals for peer review. But before they could publish, James Weatherby died, peacefully in his sleep at age 75. His death wasn't suspicious or unusual, simply the natural end of a long life. Yet it left Margaret alone with the research, unsure how to proceed without her partner's scientific credibility lending weight to their controversial findings. She filed the report away, returning to more conventional historical research. The Blackwood photograph retreated back into obscurity, occasionally mentioned in books about unexplained phenomena, but never attracting serious academic attention. Decades passed. Margaret Thorne retired from academic life, settling into quiet anonymity. The Blackwood photograph remained in the Imperial War Museum's collection, occasionally displayed in exhibitions about World War I photography, but rarely remarked upon. Then came the digital age, and with it, technology that would have seemed like magic to Arthur Pemberton and his plate camera. In 2019, the Imperial War Museum launched a comprehensive digitization project, scanning their entire photographic archive at unprecedented resolution. Every image would be available online, preserved digitally for future generations. The Blackwood photograph was scanned in April 2019 using equipment capable of capturing details invisible to the human eye: microscopic grain structure, subtle variations in density, information embedded in the physical medium that had never been fully analyzed. Dr. Amanda Chen, the digital archivist overseeing the project, noticed the background anomaly immediately. At 32, she belonged to a generation that had grown up with digital imaging, understanding pixels and compression algorithms the way earlier generations understood chemical darkrooms. But she also had a deep respect for analog photography and its unique properties. The high-resolution scan revealed details no one had previously seen. At maximum magnification, the figure in the background became more defined and more disturbing. Its outline was impossibly sharp in some areas and blurred in others, creating a visual paradox that shouldn't exist in analog photography. There appeared to be patterns within its form, geometric shapes that repeated at scales both large and small. suggesting fractal complexity that human forms don't possess. Most unsettling were what might be its eyes, two dark voids that seemed to draw attention even at low resolution, becoming more prominent with enhancement. Looking at them directly on the computer screen gave Amanda a sensation like vertigo, as if the depth perception was somehow wrong. She ran the image through modern forensic software designed to detect photo manipulation. The results were inconclusive. Technically, the image showed no signs of tampering, but the figure's properties were so unusual that the software couldn't definitively classify it as either authentic or altered. It existed in an analytical grey zone. Amanda discovered Margaret Thorne's earlier research while searching for background information. She contacted Margaret, now 88 years old, and living in a care facility outside London. They spoke by phone, Margaret's voice weak, but her memory sharp when discussing the photograph. "I spent years trying to understand it," Margaret said. "James and we were so close to something. But what? We documented the phenomenon, but we couldn't explain it. Science demands explanation, and we had none to offer that wouldn't sound like fantasy." "What do you think it is?" Amanda asked. "After all your research, what's your conclusion?" A long silence on the line. Then, "I think something terrible happened in that place. So much death, so much pain, concentrated into such a small area of Earth. And I think, I'm an old woman now, I can say this without worrying about my reputation, I think it left something behind. Not a ghost, not in the traditional sense. Something more fundamental, a mark, an impression. Something that occasionally becomes visible under the right conditions, when light and chemistry and timing align in specific ways. But what does that mean? What is it?" "My dear," Margaret said gently, "I've spent 40 years asking that question. I don't have an answer. Perhaps there isn't one. Perhaps some mysteries resist human understanding, not because we lack sufficient knowledge, but because they exist outside the framework of what can be known. The universe is stranger than we imagine, stranger than we can imagine. That figure in the photograph might be evidence of that strangeness." Amanda continued her analysis, applying every technique available to modern digital forensics. She created 3D reconstructions from the image data, mapped light sources, analyzed grain patterns at microscopic scales. Each analysis revealed new impossibilities. The figure shouldn't exist given the physical laws governing photography, yet it undeniably did exist, captured on a glass plate over a century ago. She shared her findings online, posting the high-resolution scans and technical analysis to forums dedicated to photographic history. The response was immediate and intense. Within days, the Blackwood photograph had gone viral, shared across social media platforms, featured on paranormal websites, discussed in comment sections numbering in the thousands. Some claimed it was definitive proof of ghosts or supernatural phenomena. Others insisted it must be a hoax, despite all technical evidence suggesting otherwise. Skeptics proposed elaborate theories about how it could have been faked using 1917 technology, though none of these theories withstood close examination. Believers incorporated it into various paranormal frameworks, seeing in it evidence for their preferred theories about life after death, dimensional overlap, or spiritual realms. The photograph became a kind of Rorschach test, revealing more about viewers' pre-existing beliefs than providing any definitive answers about what it actually showed. In late 2019, a team of researchers from MIT's Media Lab contacted Amanda, proposing a comprehensive analysis using artificial intelligence trained to detect anomalies in historical photographs. They ran the Blackwood image through their system, along with thousands of other World War I photographs for comparison. The AI's analysis was detailed and technical, but its conclusion was startlingly simple. The figure in the background didn't match the statistical patterns of any known photographic artifact, environmental condition, or equipment malfunction. It also didn't match the patterns of human subjects in similar photographs. According to the AI's assessment, the figure occupied an analytical space between definitely artificial and definitely authentic, a classification the system had no framework for properly categorizing. In other words, Dr. Sarah Chen, who led the MIT team, explained in an interview, "Our system is telling us this shouldn't exist as it appears to exist. It's not saying it's fake, it's saying it doesn't fit any category we've programmed it to recognize. That's deeply unusual." Indeed, the media attention reached its peak in January 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic shifted global focus to more immediate concerns. Several television documentaries featured the photograph. The Imperial War Museum reported record traffic to its online archive, with the Blackwood photograph being their most viewed image. Margaret Thorne gave several interviews from her care facility, finally able to discuss her decades of research without fear of academic ridicule. Then inevitably, the attention faded. New mysteries emerged, new viral phenomena captured public imagination, and the Blackwood photograph retreated back into relative obscurity. It remained easily accessible in the museum's online archive, occasionally rediscovered by researchers or paranormal enthusiasts, but no longer generating headlines. Amanda Chen continued her work, occasionally returning to the photograph. She never found a definitive explanation. Neither did anyone else, despite thousands of hours of analysis by researchers, scientists, and amateur investigators around the world. In March 2023, Margaret Thorne died peacefully at age 92. In her effects was a leather-bound journal containing her personal thoughts about the Blackwood photograph, never published, never shared. Her family donated it to the Imperial War Museum's archives, where it now resides alongside the photograph that had defined so much of her later life. The journal's final entry, dated just 3 weeks before her death, read, "I've spent more than 40 years with this mystery. I've analyzed, measured, theorized, and investigated. I've spoken with witnesses, examined documents, and applied every tool of historical research to understanding what that photograph captured. And at the end of all that work, I must accept that I still don't know. Perhaps that's appropriate." The war itself was something beyond human comprehension, industrial slaughter on a scale humanity had never seen. Maybe it's fitting that it left behind mysteries that resist our understanding. Sometimes I think that figure, whatever it is, stands as a kind of monument to all we cannot know, all we cannot explain, all that exceeds our ability to categorize and control. It was there on October 15, 1917. It remains there in the photograph today, and we still don't know what it is. Perhaps we never will. The photograph remains in the Imperial War Museum's collection, now digitally preserved and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Thousands of people view it each year. Some see nothing unusual. Others see the figure immediately and feel the same unease that Arthur Pemberton felt in 1917, that Margaret Thorne felt in 1979, that Amanda Chen felt in 2019. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood never knew his photograph would become famous. He died in 1954, carrying his war memories to the grave, without ever learning that something impossible had been captured, standing behind him on that rainy October day. The same is true for all the soldiers in that photograph. They posed for what they thought was a routine military portrait, a simple documentation of their unit before the next battle. What stood behind them, watching silently from the ruins? What was captured on Arthur Pemberton's glass plate, preserved in silver halide crystals for over a century? These questions remain unanswered. Today, if you visit Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre in northern France, you'll find a peaceful agricultural area showing few signs of its violent past. The farmhouse ruins where the figure stood are long gone, replaced by modern buildings and cultivated fields. But the ground remembers. Farmers still occasionally unearth fragments of the war. Shell casings, buttons, pieces of equipment corroded by decades underground. Local residents rarely discuss the old stories about the area, the legends about boundaries being thin, about things that walked at night after the war. Those who remember such tales usually dismiss them as superstition, products of a traumatized generation trying to make sense of incomprehensible horror. Yet sometimes visitors report unusual experiences in the area, a feeling of being watched, shadows that move at the edge of vision, photographs that show anomalies in the background, though nothing as dramatic as the Blackwood photograph, nothing that can't be explained away as lens flare or digital artifact. The truth about what was captured in that 1917 photograph remains elusive, perhaps unknowable. Was it something supernatural, a genuine ghost or spiritual presence? Was it some kind of temporal anomaly, a tear in reality caused by the intense trauma of war? Was it an unknown natural phenomenon that we simply lack the scientific framework to understand? Or was it something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into any category we've created? We don't know. Perhaps we can't know. The photograph stands as evidence that something was there, something that shouldn't have been there, something that violates our understanding of how photography works and what can be captured on film. But beyond that basic fact, interpretation remains open, subject to individual belief and bias. What we do know is this: 12 soldiers posed for a photograph on October 15, 1917, behind the front lines at Beaucourt-sur-l'Ancre. Behind them, approximately 50 yards distant, something stood among the ruins. That something was captured on 2 separate glass plate exposures, analyzed by experts across multiple generations using technology ranging from magnifying glasses to artificial intelligence, and remains unexplained despite over a century of examination. It's still there, preserved in that photograph, standing silently in the background while the soldiers face the camera. It hasn't moved. It hasn't changed. It remains exactly as it appeared that rainy October day, watching, waiting, existing in that strange space between the explicable and the impossible. And we still don't know what it is. Conclusion: if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War I's most perplexing mysteries, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you think about this photograph. Do you believe it's evidence of something supernatural, or do you think there's a rational explanation we just haven't found yet? If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos exploring more historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most fascinating questions are the ones that don't have clear answers.